Good morning. Thanks for joining us at Cascade Church here online. We're excited to worship with you this morning. One thing we wanted to let you know about is men. If you haven't known yet or you haven't heard yet, our men's group has started back up, and we meet at Tuesday nights at 6:30 in the worship center here. And we're going through a series on the book of James. So if you haven't been able to come back and join us yet, then this might be a great way to step back into community with other men. We're going to go into a time of worship now, so would you join us?
I believe in the sun. Oh, I believe in the risen one. Oh, I believe I overcome by the power of His blood. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my song join the one that never ends because He lives. I was dead in the grave. I was covered in my sin and shame. I heard mercy call my name. He rolled the stone away. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my song join the one that never ends because He lives. I can face tomorrow because He lives. Every fear is gone. Well, I know He holds my life, my future in His hands. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my song join the one that never ends. Amen. Amen. I'm alive because He lives. Amen. Amen. Let my song join the one that never ends because He lives. Because He lives. Because He lives. I can face tomorrow because He lives. All fear is gone because I know Once it's a gentle and thundering noise, oh God, all that you are is so overwhelming. I delight myself in you, captivated by your beauty. I'm overwhelmed by you. God, I run into your arms, unashamed because of mercy. I'm overwhelmed by you. I know the power of your cross, forgiven and free forever. You're being my God, and all that you are is so overwhelming. I delight myself in you, captivated by your beauty. I'm overwhelmed by you. God, I run into your arms, unashamed because of mercy. I'm overwhelmed, 'cause I'm overwhelmed by you. You are beautiful, you are beautiful, oh God, there is no one more beautiful. You are beautiful, God, you are the most beautiful. You are wonderful, oh God, there is no one more wonderful. You are wonderful, God, you are the most wonderful. You're glorious, Lord. You are glorious, oh God, there is no one more glorious. You are glorious, God, you are the most glorious. I delight myself in you, captivated by your beauty. I'm overwhelmed by you. God, I run into your arms, unashamed because of mercy. I'm overwhelmed by you. So overwhelmed,
Good morning. Welcome to Cascade Church. I hope you had an amazing week. Last Sunday was incredible, just celebrating Resurrection Sunday with you. We heard a lot of amazing feedback about how you connected with the Easter service and the Good Friday service. And I hope the week that followed last week was an amazing week just to walk in the goodness of Jesus' love and sacrifice for you. Today, this week, we are jumping back into our series that we've been doing, Reconnect. We actually stayed with it last week, and we'll tie that in today. But we are talking about what it means to reconnect. And we are excited to see more people coming back to the live service, more people feeling the freedom, doing what they need to do to step back into the community inside the building. We can't wait for you to be with us. And until then, you're still reconnecting with us in this manner. What does it mean to reconnect? What does it mean to not just know, love God, love people, live generously, but what does it mean for us to reconnect with that and really start living it out. What we see is what happened last week when Jesus died on the cross. He was setting the bar high. Have you ever had that in your life when someone just set the bar really, really high? I remember the first time that I kind of was confronted by that was in middle school in PE class when all of my friends were growing. They're getting tall. They were really getting good at basketball, and they were jumping and like touching the net. And one of them was able to jump and actually dunk the basketball in middle school. And I remember seeing that one, just excited. That looks like an amazing amount of fun. I want to be able to do that. So I would run and I would jump, and I was about 3.5 feet away from the net. And I thought to myself, all right, I just have to grow. I just have to grow a little bit, then I'll be able to do the same thing. And as it turns out, I'm just short. And I just don't have what it takes, right? So the bar was set high, and it was completely unattainable. It was something that I would never be able to do, no matter how much jumping, no matter how much muscles I built on my leg. Like, I just didn't have what it took to reach the bar that had been set in front of me. And a lot of the times we look to Jesus' life and we feel that he set the bar so high that he was fully God. There's just no way that we could live the life that he lived. And that's one of the beauties of this series that we're looking at, is that if we can really trust Jesus' words here in John chapter 13 that we're about to read, if we can really trust and believe in the words of his disciples in John, when he said in 1 John 2:6, anyone that claims to abide in him should walk as Jesus walked. And in 1 Peter 2, verse 21, Peter says a similar thing, that Jesus had set us an example so that we should walk in those ways. So both of these men, both of these disciples, acknowledged that Jesus set the bar high, but it was an attainable goal. And then with this, I think about playing Frisbee golf, because in the same way, I love to play with people that are better than me, because that's pretty much everybody. But the thing is, when I'm out there with Stu or with Derek or with my boys, and I'm watching them throw, and all of them can throw further than me, I know that that bar is not set too high. And by playing with them and watching them throw and learning from them, I can do that. I've got the muscle capacity, I've got the body movement, I just have to figure it out. The bar is set high, but I know it's within reach. I know it's reasonable to be able to do that. And that is the good message of what we're doing right now, is we are reconnecting with what it means to love God like Jesus. What we find is that's an attainable goal. We can love God the way Jesus loved God. And here, what we're moving into today and what we saw last week is Jesus set the bar high for what it means to love people. But today we find that we can. It is a high bar, but it is an achievable measure. It's an achievable goal to love people the way Jesus loved people. And that is the message of John 13 that we're going to be reading today. So open up your word, and I'm actually going to start by moving towards the middle to the end of the passage with John 13, verse 17. Read this with me. Jesus had just got done talking about the example that he was setting for his disciples. And this is what he says. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. See, Jesus sets up a clear statement here that is saying it's not just about knowing the example that I've set. It's not just about knowing these truths. It's not just about saying, yeah, I love God, or I love people. It's not just knowing that, conceptually loving people, or you have a pleasant disposition around people. What Jesus is saying here is that you have to do these things. Love is an action. Love is something that he demonstrated. Love is something that he did so that we can step in his ways. Jesus lived an amazing story that we can follow. And if this point is missing, there's something big missing from our life. My wife and I are reading this book by Donald Miller. I told you about him a little while ago with his book, Scary Close. This is another book that we are reading right now. And we're actually taking another younger couple that we've been discipling through this book. But it's called 1,000,000 Miles in 1,000 Years, How I Learned to Live a Better Story. Now, Don, he's known to write incredible books, and he's been writing amazing things. He knows amazing things and knows how to capture it in story form. But what he realized one day is that his life, the life that he was actually living, was actually really boring. There wasn't much to it. It was all about him. And when he really started to study story and how to tell a good story through a movie, he actually started to learn that his life, if it was captured in a movie, was really boring, that it was missing something. And he wanted to be able to tell a better story with his life. Something was missing from his life. And what he dives into is that it was missing action. It was not missing the knowledge of what it meant to love people or to love God. It was missing the action of actually stepping into it and doing it, living the life that Jesus lived. And what we find here is what we see, God is inviting us, he's actually commanding us to step into his story, a greater story than just us, a greater story than just trying to figure out how to take care of our life and figure our life out. There's a greater story out there. There's the story of Jesus that he invites us and commands us to step into. And the only way to do that is by loving people like Jesus. We find life living Jesus's life. We find life by loving people. So open up John 13. That's what this chapter is all about. And we're going to jump into that, going back to the very beginning, starting with verse 1. This is what we find. Now, before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. I love the way that's laid out. So this is John chapter 13. This is Jesus' last meal with the disciples before he's taken away by the Roman guards to do what we saw last week. So these are Jesus' last words, last actions, the last things that he is giving to his disciples before he leaves and is crucified. So they're pretty important. And I love the way it sets it up here, that he loved those who were his own. Can you get a sense for that? We're talking about what it means to love people, and we understand how that's defined by the way Jesus loved the disciples. And it says that he loved them because they were his own. Like they were his people. It was like they were his children. They were his friends. They were his inner circle that he went to. He loved them. He called them out of the crowds, called them out of the 120 that were around, called them to be his people that were the 12 around him, and he loved them to the very end. Man, I want to be in that circle. I want to be loved by Jesus in that way. That's something that just sounds so appealing, to be loved by him. And check this out, what it says next. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So we see that even this guy, even Judas, was loved by Jesus to the very end. That's an amazing amount of love. And then that gives me a lot of hope that as frustrating, as annoying, and as much of a failure as I can be, Jesus is going to love me to the very end. That is a circle that I am welcomed in, that I'm known, that I'm cared for, that Jesus pulls me into to provide something for me and to help me to learn something incredible. So let's keep reading as this kind of grows more and more appealing. In verse 3, this is what Jesus said. It says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he rose from the supper and checked this action out. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This is a story that I think we're a little too familiar with because we know that Jesus washed his disciples' feet, but to step back and to put this in its place, when Jesus stood up at this important dinner, their last Seder meal, The most important person in the room stood up and began disrobing. I'm sure the disciples were just like, well, shut the door, shut the curtains. Like, what is Jesus doing? Like, what is going on? Like, immediately, they were thrown off guard. Why is Jesus taking off his clothes? Their master, the person they looked to, that they followed the example of, like they were seeing this man disrobe in front of everyone. How humiliating. And then in their eyes, it got even worse because he went and he took a towel, tied it around his waist, and he started filling up a water basin. And then they knew what Jesus was doing. He was doing something that was amazingly embarrassing. Jesus was stepping to the level of a servant, most of the times a Greek servant, because no Jew wanted to do this, to be the servant that would wash the feet of the people who were coming there, who were coming into the house. They had to be ceremonially clean. And they had to be physically clean to not bring into the house the things that they were bringing into the house from walking in the streets. This was a disgusting job, a demeaning job, a demoralizing job, a job of humility. And Jesus, the creator of the world, took his clothes off and stepped into the form of a servant. Read Philippians 2 after describing this. He took off his outer garments, he stepped into the role of a servant, and he washed the disciples' feet. It wasn't just enough for Jesus to say, all right, you know I love you. You know I sacrifice for you. You know that I lead you, that I care for your needs, that I know you. It's one thing for Jesus to have said that, but Jesus demonstrated that with actions that spoke louder than words. Like what we find is the disciples were completely taken off guard. And that was Jesus' point. He wanted them to see a demonstration of love that would connect to the very beginning of his ministry and predict what was going to come in the impending hours that were just around the corner. This one action summarized all of Jesus' life, and then he lived it out to his disciples. Now, when he was doing this was not only demoralizing for someone, but when someone was doing this act, they got to know the people really well. I mean, imagine this. Jesus knew his disciples' feet. I know some of you are cringing and probably having a little gag reflex right now, right? Jesus knew his disciples so well that he knew their feet. He knew that Philip had a crooked toe. He knew that John's ankle twisted just a little bit to the left. He knew that Peter had some really hairy toes. Like he knew his disciples' feet. That was very intimate. Being able to know his disciples that well. And he sat down and uniquely cared for each one of their feet. He took the time to know them. He took the time to care for them in the ways that their feet needed care. Dirt in certain places where other people's were clean, and the little areas that he had to dig into that other feet didn't have to have. Jesus was willing to do that because he wanted to know them and he wanted to care for them. That's amazing. Catch what Jesus is showing his disciples in the midst of all of this. As we keep reading, like we see Peter kind of taking a step back, but listen to what Jesus is saying about what he's doing. Jesus says, "What I am doing now, you do not understand, but afterwards you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash your feet, you will have no share with me." And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only then, but also my hands and my head." See, Jesus was stepping into an action, an active love that blew his disciples away. And at first, Peter was just like, wait, you can't do this. And Jesus was showing them, like, I've got to demonstrate this to you. Because you may not understand this action right now. But when I die and raise from the dead, you're going to connect the dots and you're going to understand that as I was cleaning your feet with this cleansing water, you'll remember the wedding at Cana, how I turned this cleansing water into wine that would symbolize my blood, the only thing that can truly cleanse you. And as Jesus was washing their feet and would soon hold a glass of wine, and direct their attention to the cross, a demonstration of his blood being given for us. All of this was coming together that the disciples would understand later and see that this was an amazing action that summed everything up, that Jesus was calling them to understand what he was doing and to live in this. When Peter says, wait, you can't do this, I will not allow you to act on my feet, what was Peter stopping Jesus from doing? If Peter didn't allow Jesus to step into the action of love, Peter would have been keeping Jesus from knowing him. Peter would have been keeping Jesus from caring for him. And Peter would have been keeping Jesus from demonstrating an action to show him how to live his life. So when Jesus said this, if I do not wash you, you'll have no share with me, Jesus was saying something huge that we need to hear. If Jesus doesn't step into action, we cannot experience things with him. And in the same way, if we don't step into living Jesus' life and acting on our love for other people, we are missing something. We are keeping things out of our life. So once Peter realized that, he was just like, all right, then I'm all in. If that's what it's going to take, I'll do this weird thing. I'll allow you to touch my feet. I'll allow you to know me, care for me, and show me how to live. He opens the doors to allow Jesus to do that. And then Jesus started to make it crystal clear. Starting in verse 12, he said this, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done? You call me teacher and Lord. You call me master. You call me rabbi. All of these words set up the relationship that the disciples have. Jesus said, you call me something because you were saying that you were looking to me to learn how to live your life. That's what a disciple does when he looks at his master. So you say that you're looking at me to learn how to live your life. You say that. You call me teacher. You call me Lord. And you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, if I have done this, if I have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I don't think Jesus was being figurative there. I think he was actually calling them to an action, to live a life like this, but also to do this, to humiliate themselves, to step down and to serve other people in the same way. Listen to what he says in verse 15. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. The same words that we hear in 1 John 2:6 and 1 Peter 2:21. For you to do just as I have done. The bar has been set high, but I'm giving you a story to live. Jesus made it crystal clear, you are my disciples, and if you're going to follow in my steps, it's not just about knowledge. You need to step in to do this exact thing. Jesus wanted to connect this and to demonstrate this, to bring all of these things together, that this was a common thread that ran throughout Jesus' life. Back at the wedding at Cana, Jesus was meeting people's needs. Jesus was caring for people. He was knowing people. All throughout his life, Jesus was knowing people, inviting people in, caring for them, meeting their needs, directing them to live a life that looked like loving the Father the way Jesus loved the Father. Here he was demonstrating that at the cross. That's exactly what he was doing. The disciples would see that this is the common thread that ran throughout all of Jesus' life. So think about it. Could you imagine living Jesus' life without loving God? It makes no sense at all. Of course, you are going to love God if you're going to love Jesus' life and live Jesus' life. But in the same way, this is what Jesus was saying here. If you're going to live my life, you have to love people in action. You have to demonstrate your love for people. You have to learn to love people the way I loved people. And that's what leads us into that verse that we read at the very beginning, that it's not just about knowing these things, but blessed are you who do them. You cannot step into the story of Jesus without loving God like Jesus, and you cannot step into the story of Jesus without loving people like Jesus. And then Jesus makes it absolutely clear. If you go to the end where Jesus summarizes everything he's been saying in chapter 13, this is what he says. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Underline that, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. And by this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So much in this verse. I've given you an example that you are supposed to follow. This new commandment that you love one another, the way you relate to each other, the way you know each other, care for each other, help each other grow. You're supposed to do that the same way I did that with you. And that opens the doors because it's not just about the closed circle of the 12. What they saw is that Jesus loved them, but hours later, he gave his life for all people. So loving one another opens doors to loving all people. So we have two different groups of people here. We have the in group, the one another's, and then we have what later is described as our neighbors, that we're supposed to love one another. We're also supposed to love our neighbor. And loving one another opens the doors to being able to love the unsaved, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And Jesus was saying, this is a defining statement. If this is not in your life, then you just need to say the reverse. If you are not loving people, then you are not my disciple. Allow that conviction to set in. If you are not loving people in action, then you are not stepping into my story. You are not following me. You are not my disciple. This is not only what opens the door to being able to love all people, but this is how they will know that you are defined by me, that you are living my life. Now, the disciples, they started to take this in, and after they saw Jesus rise from the dead and they started connecting the dots, remembering the example when Jesus ascended into heaven, they knew that their responsibility was to create communities that loved one another the way Jesus loved one another, that helped them love God the way Jesus loved God. So we saw them to understand that loving people like Jesus means that we love one another the way Jesus loved one another. And that we love all people. We love our neighbor the way Jesus loved our neighbors. And they started to build these communities, and we read about it in Acts. And what we're going to do is as we go through Acts and see the communities that they built, they mirrored Jesus' example in John chapter 13 and the life of Jesus. One of the things that they would do when they get together, they would sing songs with one another. And this isn't one of their songs. You may recognize it, but this song captures the heart of these communities that were learning to love people like Jesus. Let me read this and see how long it takes you to catch on to what the song is. This song is so relatable. Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got, right? You can see that for the disciples. Making your way in the world today takes everything you got. I can feel it today for us. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? The answer is yes. I would love to get away from the world. I would love to find somewhere where my worries could go away. Listen to the chorus of the song, and you may recognize it now if you haven't already. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. This is the theme song for Cheers back in the 80s. If any of you watched that, I wasn't allowed to because there's drinking involved. My parents were just like, none of that, right? So that was banned from my house. But I remember the little piano intro. I remember hearing that song. And even back then, that song captured me because I could feel my heart agreeing, that's what I want. And what we see is that these communities that the disciples built were answering the needs that this song taps into. So open up to Acts, go over to Acts chapter 2, and you start to see the disciples, after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, immediately the disciples started to live out Jesus' life and build these communities that existed to help people love God like Jesus and to love people like Jesus. That was the whole point of these communities. So let's see what happens in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 and 46, listen to what we find. It says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of the bread and prayers. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. What do you see in this over and over again? Like, I know we immediately want to focus on the apostles' teaching. We're going to get there in a second. But everything else is about people being devoted to knowing each other. Food, food, food. It's mentioned 3 times in here. You don't go to the big auditorium and to the big sermon for food. You go to people's houses. So these big groups that were meeting together to hear from the apostles would break into these smaller groups, into these house churches where they would know each other, where they would break bread with each other, where they would share food, share meals, share life with each other. And this was the avenue for people to know each other, just as Jesus knelt down and knew the disciples' feet, and knew the disciples' life, and lived life with the disciples, had so many meals with the disciples. And they weren't all spiritual conversations. They were just life conversations. How are you doing today? What has happened today? What did you think about today? What did you think about the sports game? All of those things. Like, they knew each other. These communities existed for them to break bread with each other and to realize that they were more than just a number. They were known. They were pulled out of those crowds into smaller groups, just like Jesus did with the disciples, so that in those smaller groups, they could be known. I want to know you the way Jesus knew me. That's what the disciples were saying here. I want to know you the way Jesus knew me. And then these communities existed for that. If you don't know me, you can't be loved by me. If I don't know you, I can't love you. I can't express any of these things. We think about Jesus' words when Peter put up his hands and said, no, you can't do this, God. You can't know me like this. I feel like so many of us in our church, we do that. We come and get lost in the crowds and just put up our hands and say, Jesus, no, I won't go to that next level. But Jesus calls us to that next level of being known. It's a step in loving people the way Jesus loved people. You have to be known. And in verse 47, this is what we find. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions, belongings, and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Just as Jesus knelt down and knew the disciples' feet, he knew how to care for those feet in a unique way. And that's what we find happening in these communities. They weren't just communities for them to be known by one another, but there were communities that opened doors for them to be cared for by one another. The more you get to know someone, the more you get to know the intricacies of their life, their strengths, their weaknesses, their joys, their sorrows. You get to know their story, and then you get to know how you can care for them. These communities existed so that they could say, I know you the way Jesus knew me, and I can care for you the way Jesus cared for me. The disciples thought about Matthew chapter 6 and Jesus' greatest sermon of all time. Like, he was talking about meeting the needs of his disciples. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. Don't worry about where you're going to eat or drink or where you're going to sleep. Don't worry about the treasures set apart on earth. I will take care of you. And Jesus demonstrated that over and over. As he got to know the disciples, he knew how to care for them. You're scared to be in a boat in a storm, so I'm going to care for you in the midst of the storm. On days that you're not catching a lot of fish, and I can see the humility in your face, and I can see the letdown, I'm going to care for you and help you catch the fish that you need to catch. I'm going to care for you because I know you. I know you're scared in the boat. I know that you're falling short in these ways. And I know you, so I can now care for you. In the same way Jesus cared for them, they turned around and taught their communities how not just to know each other, but to care for one another in action, to meet the needs in each other's lives. Loving people like Jesus means we know people like Jesus, and it means that we care for people the way Jesus cared for people. But it pushes us even further than that. In Acts 2:42, let's go back to what it said at the beginning. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. The central focus of everything, of knowing and caring for people, was to open the doors to helping people grow to be like Jesus. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings. The last thing Jesus said is that I want you to go and baptize people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, not stopping there, but teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. So the disciples, the apostles, would teach these commandments to the people. Those people would take them into their homes, and not only would they be known and cared for in these groups, but they would be grown in these groups. The purpose of meeting in these houses was to open the doors to spiritual growth so that they too could become like Jesus. What does it mean to love one another? It means to be in a community, a smaller community, drawn out of the crowds into a house, into a smaller group of people where you're known, cared for, and grown in Christ. That is the point of everything. Christ-like growth happens in the context of smaller community. You see that all through the scripture. Everyone, every single person we read about was drawn into a smaller group of people where they grew in their faith. If that's missing in your life, there's going to be missing growth in your life. God calls us into this. This is what it means to love one another the way Jesus loved one another. To come into a smaller context where we're known, cared for, and grown in Christ. And that opens the door to the next part, where it says, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people, not just the insiders, but the people of the world, the unsaved. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. By loving one another, that opened the doors to loving their neighbors. So there in Jerusalem, as they were building these communities, people were looking in and they were seeing needs being met. They were seeing people being known, cared for, growing into being just like this man, Jesus, they saw years earlier doing all of these amazing things. And now their neighbors, the people of Jerusalem, were seeing what was happening. They were being impacted by relationships. These people in the church were going out into the world, going to their jobs, going to their families, going to their neighbors, and they were getting to know their neighbors. And they were caring for their neighbors. And they were looking for the opportunity through that knowledge of who they were, building that relationship, investing in that relationship, sacrificing themselves to care for their neighbors. That opened the door to their neighbors asking the question, what is wrong with you? What is different about you? Why are you doing these things? And that's when the people would say, let me invite you into a growing relationship with their neighbor. Let me tell you about Jesus. Let me invite you into the one another crowd. Let me bring you into the family so that you can know Jesus, who changes everything. Loving one another opens the door to loving people. And as you read the book of Acts, it's beautiful the way Jesus said, you will be my witnesses here in Jerusalem and then in Judea and Samaria and then to the ends of the world. As you read through the book of Acts, this book that contains the first 30 years, what you see is groups of one another communities moving from Jerusalem into Judea. And when these one another groups went into Judea, it opened doors to the neighbors in Judea. And they started knowing them, caring for them, loving them, having these conversations with them, inviting them into growing in who Jesus is. And then they moved from Judea to Samaria. And then later from Samaria, Paul took it to the ends of the world. You see this happening all over, that to love people like Jesus meant to love one another and to love your neighbor, to love one another like Jesus loved one another, to love people like Jesus loved people. This was the way Jesus lived his life. This was the story of Jesus. It was bigger than just the disciples. He was inviting them into living out his story. And that's what the disciples did. They learned to love one another like Jesus. They learned to love their neighbors like Jesus. So the question comes back to us. Do we, the people at Cascade, who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, who claim to abide in him, do we walk as Jesus walked? Are we following in his steps, in his example? Do we love people like Jesus? I love seeing this start to take place in our church. I love seeing this has been taking place in our church. This is a characteristic of who we are, and we are growing more in this challenge. Today, I want you to hear the challenge the same way Jesus said it. If this is missing from your life, there's something big missing from your life. If you are not loving people like Jesus, hear the conviction of verse 17 and verse 35. If this is missing from your life, you are not my disciple. But also hear the encouragement of what Jesus is saying. I want to invite you into living a story that is bigger than just yourself. A story that's not just consumed with how to take care of your family and how to write a little script for who you are in the short little time you're going to spend here. Let me invite you into a greater story, a story that's not only going to take care of your family, but a story that's going to open the doors to changing the world. God wants to use you to write a better story, the story of Jesus Christ lived out in your life as you love people like Jesus. That is what we are about at Cascade Community Church, to love God like Jesus and to love people like Jesus. We want to set up communities that help you love one another like Jesus. And we want to help encourage you to love your neighbors like Jesus, because we want to love people the same way Jesus did, the same way the disciples did. And we want to see Cascade step into the story of Jesus Christ. So as we reconnect with this theme, we wanted to do it in more creative ways. We wanted to do it in bigger ways to really help encourage all of us to step into this. So we've got something that we want to make available to you. So I have to explain what this is not, and then explain what this is. But first, you have to see it. So I don't know how we're going to do this, but here it comes. There we go. We made it happen. So what we have here, like I said, I want to explain what it's not so that you can better understand what it is. We have a lot of things here with the L3 logo on it. The L3, love God, love people, live generously, is our mission here at Cascade Community Church. But what you find missing on all of these things is any mention of Cascade Community Church, because none of this is designed to promote the church. All of this is designed to promote the vision of living like Jesus. So we want to offer all of these things to you to help you do two things. First, to step into loving people yourself, to step into loving one another yourself. All of these things, like when you see other people wearing them and you see them out in the community, what you know is immediately you're not just a number, you're part of a family. And you have the opportunity to step into a community to be known. So whether you see someone with an L3 mug, a hoodie, a t-shirt, a journal, or these stickers on the car, that's an invitation for you to take the step to get to know someone, to know who is in the family. And I would encourage you to ask the question, who is our inner circle? Who is the small group of people that I'm known by, that I'm cared for by, that are encouraging me to grow in my faith and are holding me accountable to taking the next step? Because the next step, this isn't just about forming your internal community and finding that. It's a challenge. It's an invitation for this to be a part of your life. You to take this out of the walls of Cascade and into your work week, into your families, into your daily life, so that hopefully you can begin to love your neighbor the way Jesus loved his neighbor. So that eventually, after people that you build a relationship with, that you get to know, and they just see this L3 pop up everywhere, and they see something different in your life, the way that you care for them, that will open up the question that they have for you. What is different about you? Why do you wear this L3 stuff? Why do you have this all over your desk? What does it mean? 1 Peter 2:21 says we're supposed to follow in his example, to know our neighbor, to care for our neighbor, and to look for these opportunities. 1 Peter 3:15 says this, always be ready to give an account for the hope that is in you. We want you to wear these things to challenge you to be ready to have the conversation, not to invite them to Cascade Community Church. It's not about church promotion, but to invite them into a relationship with Jesus Christ. If someone were to ask me what my sweater was about, like what these things were about, this is the way that I would answer them. I would tell them, well, it stands for the way I want to live my life. I think this world needs a lot of things, but what our world needs most is more people that are willing to live and love like Jesus. I think our world needs a group of people that are willing to love God the way Jesus loved God. That's radically different than a lot of the things you hear or see on TV. I think that that this world needs to see a group of people that are willing to love one another the way Jesus loved one another. That's inspiring. I believe what this world needs is a group of people that are willing to live generously like Jesus. And that's what L3 stands for, a group of people that are willing to love God like Jesus, love people like Jesus, and live generously like Jesus. So again, we make no money on this. We're selling these super cheap because it's not about money. It's not about church promotion. It's about promoting a lifestyle. It's about us looking to Jesus's example and us trying to live our life the way he lived his life and loving people the way Jesus loved people. And we want to invite you into community and into living a better story. That's the invitation to you. So today, the way we're ending things, we're ending with communion. Communion was a symbol that Jesus used to show us what he did for us and to call us to live in his example. They're reminders to us of what he did and what we are called to do. Just like all of these other things are just symbols that we use to call our attention to a life that Jesus wants us to live. In the same way, this is the most beautiful and sacred symbol that Jesus used for us. So I just want to invite you to pull the elements out and get ready. Pause if you need to pause. But these symbols that Jesus gave us, this is what Jesus did with the disciples in John chapter 13 after he washed the disciples' feet. And I can only imagine what it would have meant to them to connect the dots of this cleansing water that he used, that was turned into wine, that he used to symbolize his blood. And as Jesus picked up this bread that was on the table and began to speak about the sacrifice that it took for him to love people, that Jesus, to demonstrate no greater love, to demonstrate his love for the world, allowed his body to be broken for us. Jesus laid himself down willingly as a sacrifice to love us. So as we take this, Jesus, we thank you for your body that was broken for us. This selfless act that demonstrates for us a bar that is set so high in the way that you showed your love to us, a people who do not deserve the sacrifice that you gave. Jesus, thank you for being broken for us so that we could find healing in you. And Jesus, in the same way, you poured out your blood to cleanse us of our sins and to bring us into your righteousness. You took on sin. You who knew no sin became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God. Jesus, as we hold this symbol of your blood that not only cleanses us, that forgives us of all of our unrighteousness, but it brings us into your righteousness. Jesus, thank you for your blood that you sacrificed to love us and to draw us into a relationship where we could finally experience the love of our Father. Jesus, thank you for pouring out over us your righteousness. And we take these and we remember what Jesus did for us. And in the same way, we hear the challenge that Jesus invites us into. The bar is set high, but it's not impossible. You can love God the way Jesus loved God. You can love people the way Jesus loved people. He's inviting us into the story. Will we remember? Will we step into what he has for us?
Come, let us worship our King. Oh, come, let us bow at his feet. He has done great things. Oh, see what the Savior has done. See how his love overcomes. He has done great things. Yes, he has done great things. Oh, hero of heaven, you conquer the grave. You free every captive, you break every chain. Oh, yeah, you have done great things. We dance in your freedom, awake and alive. Oh, Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high. Oh, God, you have done great things. Been faithful through every storm. You'll be faithful forevermore. You have done great things, and I know you will do it again. For your promise is yes and amen. For you will do great things. God, you do great things. Oh, hero of heaven, you conquer the grave. You free every captive and break every chain. Oh, God, you have done great things. We dance in your freedom, awake and alive. Oh, Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high. Oh, God, you have done great things. Hallelujah, God, above it all. Hallelujah, God, unshakable. Hallelujah, you have done great things. Let's sing that again. Say hallelujah, God, above it all. Hallelujah, God, unshakable. Hallelujah, you have done great things. You've done great things. Oh, hero of heaven, you conquer the grave. You free every captive and break every chain. Oh, God, you have done great things. We dance in your freedom, awake and alive. Oh, Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high. Oh, God, you have done great things. You have done great things. Oh, God, you do great things.
Thanks again for joining us today here at Cascade Church Online. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you're joining us on Facebook, please like and share this video with others as well so they can see it. I want to remind you as well for giving. If you want to give and support the ministry that we're doing here at Cascade Church, you can text Cascade to 77977 or by any of the other ways you see on the screen behind me. One last thing we wanted to let you know about was our merch store. As Michael mentioned earlier, we have a whole bunch of stuff available for you. And we've got journals, we've got stickers. So if you're interested in any of these things, then it'll be available here at Cascade on Sundays. Thank you again for joining us and have a good day.